Okay, everybody, I'm going to share my screen and we are going to take a look at buyer documents. So if you have any questions, unmute yourself, ask me. I'm happy to answer any questions. We're going to start with the RVAR documents that are buyer oriented. So in this case, we have a exclusive right to represent buyer agreement. You do have the option to do a non-exclusive. Donna, would you close my door pretty please?
Yeah,
Thank you so much. I'm out of practice, y'all. We do have the option to use a non-exclusive right to represent buyer agreement. It is not very protective of you, the buyer's agreement. My goal for you is that you end up in an exclusive right to represent buyer agreement. Now, you may choose as a business practice to start with a non-exclusive right to represent buyer agreement or and then flip them into an exclusive right to represent buyer agreement. That is usually done when the buyer is a little hesitant to sign anything with you or to commit only to you. So what my preference would be is if you are undecided on your buyer, I would recommend you use an exclusive right to represent buyer agreement and perhaps do a short term. That way, if you've decided you do not want to work with this buyer long term, then you can work with them until the term of their buyer's agreement ends, and then you can politely decline re-upping with them. So that'll give you an opportunity to kind of work with them a little bit, find out if it's going to be a good fit for you, because y'all know I'm all about the buyers and sellers, but today I'm really about protecting y'all and helping y'all be successful in our market. I'm gonna try to turn my look, y'all. These new phones gonna be the death of me. Okay, so let's do the exclusive right to represent buyer agreement. Let's assume I've decided I want to work long term with these buyers. So what I'm filling out is the agreement date of April 9th between Wainwright and Company Realtors and my buyer, Betty Buyer. I've said my purpose is acquire real estate. I used to write in there that it was acquire residential real estate. Well, then if they decided they wanted to buy some land and build, I wasn't really protected here. I wasn't guaranteed to be paid a commission. So now I just leave it very generic, acquire real estate. You can use this space to customize your buyer's agreement. We have an agent, and I've done one of these with one of our lake agents where I helped them shop in Roanoke and off into Blacksburg. She helped them shop at Smith Mountain Lake. And so we each had an exclusive right to represent buyer agreement with these buyers. Mine said acquire real estate in Roanoke or the New River Valley MLS. Hers said acquire real estate in the Franklin County, Bedford County area of Smith Mountain Lake. You can have two exclusive right to represent buyer agreements at the same time, so long as the purpose is different. So this is how you can be shopping in Blacksburg with a New River Valley agent. You could be shopping in Roanoke with a Roanoke agent. You can have two separate exclusive right to represent buyer agreements as a buyer, and you're not violating anything. That does not mean it is non-problematic. Of course, the buyer is going to end up finding a house in Elliston that's in the New River Valley MLS and in the Roanoke MLS, and you guys are going to have to decide how you're going to work that out. But this is a fairly used practice because buyers don't always just say, I'm only buying in Roanoke. They may say, well, we do our forever home at Smith Mountain Lake if we could find the right one, but we could do our sort of home in Roanoke if we find that one first. And then additionally, you can use this purpose here to describe the geographic area that you will go to. So if you are getting hired by a buyer and you're going to represent them and they say, you know what? We're wide open. We just want a mini farm and we can be anywhere on this side of the state. Cool. I don't know that I want to show you everything on this entire side of the state. So I may say to them, listen, to be honest with you, I really only feel like I can properly represent you with showing you homes within a, 30-mile radius of Roanoke. or Smith Mountain Lake or whatever you want to put on here. And so you can carve out in purpose what your duties are. That way, when they say, can we go see a house in Richmond or outside or Northern Virginia, you can say, I'm so sorry, that is outside of my geographic area that we decided on the buyer's agreement, but I'd be delighted to help you find an agent up there who might be willing to show it to you. How to make that happen is another conversation for another day, but this is where you would carve out for, do you, the buyer's agent, have some special terms under which you're willing to work for these buyers? And then we have our term. So I have had this buyer's agency agreement. It always begins on the day it is executed. And in this case, we're going to pretend they executed it on April 9th, the same date that we made the agreement. This must be done prior to showing them houses. So you'll see in these documents, the buyer's agency agreement is signed April 9th, and then the purchase agreement is signed later in April. Because, theoretically, we met, we decided to work together, then we started looking at houses and we found the house to make an offer on later. Yes, sometimes you sign the agreement, you go look at houses that day, and they write an offer that day. According to the Department of Justice and National Association of Realtors settlement last year, that should be the exception, not the rule. So these need to be executed before you show them a home. And you can make it, like I said earlier, you can make it for the day. You can make for a specific property. It does not have to be for a long term. But this is an example of a buyer that this agent's going to be working with long term, helping them secure their first home. So we're going to go down through our broker and buyer's agent's duties, as well as the buyer's duties. I'm going to explain these to my buyer to make sure they understand. This is also a perfect opportunity to remind them, hey, if you want to go to open houses, totally cool with me. Here's a stack of my business cards. Please present one of these when you go into an open house. Or if you don't have them with you, would you please just make sure you mention to the agent holding the open house that you are already working with me as a buyer's agent. Good news, they'll kind of leave you alone and you can kind of just check out the house then at that point. Then we go down to service fee. I do not charge a service fee, so I put 0 in there. We may see a cultural industry shift where we start doing a short-term exclusive right to represent buyer agreement and charging a small service fee, which previously had been called a showing fee. That is a concept you could do here. In my mind, I'm trying to lock down a relationship with these buyers, and we are going to work together until they find a home. So I have not had to do any of these sort of short-term buyers agreements yet, where I'm charging a showing fee or a service fee to show them 4 houses on a Saturday. But I do know there are agents in the market and firms in the market doing that. There is nothing wrong with doing that. It's a decision for you to make as to where is your value, what is your value, what do you plan on doing as a best business practice for you and any sort of buyer leads you may receive. And then in 8, we've got our brokerage fee. And I have the conversation with my buyers that buyer's agent compensation is definitely negotiable, which is, I have been doing this a long time. My experience and my negotiation skills and my value is why I price my services at 3% of the purchase price. The negotiable part is you absolutely could find another agent who would work potentially for less than that. That is what I work for. But I wanted to have the conversation with you, buyer, up front before we look at homes, before you receive the benefit of all of my services and my resources and all of the connections I've built over 20 some years, to let you have the option to decide whether that value is there for you and whether you'd like to work with me or not. Potentially, that's not going to work for you, Mr. Buyer, and that's okay. I'm happy to see if there's an agent at my firm who I might be able to refer you to, who would be willing to work for less than what I charge. But this is what I charge, and it's 3%. And you're going to authorize me later in this document to ask for that as a seller paid concession on any offer we may submit. So I don't anticipate you having to have this money out of pocket. However, this contract does say that that is what my fee is and that is what my firm will be expecting to receive if and when we close on a home. And so I will help you brainstorm other ways to get it incorporated and built into our offer so that we can make sure this is the last ditch effort is that you would have to pay out of pocket for this. We're going to try to wrap this in, bake it in with the cake, and make sure this is part of our offer so that it comes to you as a seller concession at closing. Now, we're going to go on down through here, and I'm going to describe the rest of this to you. I do not typically put in an extension here. When our time is up, our time is up, and we will just execute a new one of these if we have not successfully secured a home for you yet. And then I wanted to take a minute to discuss dual agency, designated agency. Dual agency happens when me, Ashley, ends up representing both the seller and the buyer. Now, I avoid that like crazy because I do not feel like I can honor all the duties I'm promising to give you on this document if I'm also going to represent the seller. And it undermines the value I can bring to both parties. And so I don't like dual agency. I don't recommend it at my firm. My firm really frowns on it because you really can't do the best job for both parties. So if the case arose that you really wanted to see one of my listings, it would make me a dual agent and I would be one. And we will go further into depth into what all that means. But in the meantime, designated agency is something much more common that may very well happen. I work at a large firm. We have a lot of listings, and you and I may be out on the road looking at houses and you fall in love with another firm listing. So it's a Wainwright listing, but I'm not the listing agent. That makes us designated agents. It does make the broker at the firm and the firm a dual agent. But in that case, we have two brokers on hand, and they will represent or they will assist the listing agent and me, the buyer's agent, separately so that we can keep everything at arm's length. And this is our fair housing disclosure and our Megan's Law disclosure. It is just stating that I will not be discriminated against you for any of the protected class reasons. And the Megan's Law disclosure is here so that you can do your homework on each property we decide to make an offer on to see if there's anything on the registered sex offenders list that may give you pause. I'm also indicating here that you've never been a licensee. And then I've added in the additional documents that you are authorizing me to use the terms of whatever offer we make to ask for the buyer's agent compensation to be paid by the seller as a term of the purchase agreement that we come to terms on. So you're authorizing me to make sure I can, quote unquote, bake it into the cake and put it in our offer so that it's asked for at the offer stage. It is negotiable. The seller's under no obligation to pay it or to make that concession, but we have to make an offer good enough to entice them to want to pay the expenses on your side, either closing costs or buyer agent compensation on your behalf. So we're going to make an offer that is very enticing to the seller so that they would want to let you build those fees into your mortgage and not have them as cash to come to closing. The last page is our signature page. It does give you a warning that there could be Ring cameras. There could be Google cameras. We have to assume there are going to be cameras in and on all the properties we go to tour. So let's have a little code. I'm going to give you a little signal. And if I feel like we're talking about something that we should maybe reserve for once we're back in the car, I'll give you that little signal so that we don't accidentally reveal any of our cards while we're in the property. Or worse yet, talk too candidly about the condition of a property and possibly undermine the goodwill there when we bring an offer on that property. So wire fraud is also alive and well. I will make sure to educate you more on that when we go under contract and when we get close to closing, because you'll be wiring your fees and your money needed to bring to the table for closing. And so we're going to make sure no wire fraud happens when you're doing that. And then we're going to sign this. And this is another whole page on dual agency and another whole page on designated agency, in case you're curious to go deeper. And now we're going to pretend it's been a few weeks. We're ready to make an offer. So on April 20th, we decided to write an offer for these buyers. And so I'm doing a very typical offer. They do not have a home to sell first. They are going to be doing an FHA loan. And we are going to be asking for the regular inspection process as it shows up on the RVAR contract. So we will go through this now, and we've got our parties at the top. We have our agents in the middle. And this is just a quick reminder that if you're working with another Wainwright agent on the other side of the transaction, then the listing agent is representing the seller and the buyer's agent, the selling agent, is representing the purchaser. However, if it says Wainwright and Wainwright on these two bottom lines, then it is both the purchaser and the seller on these. When you have designated agency, meaning Becky listed it and Rich sold it, they both work for Wainwright. So it's Becky representing the seller and Rich representing the purchaser, and Wainwright and Company representing both the purchaser and the seller. Okay, if you have any questions about that, let me know. And then we're going to go down here to our addenda. Y'all, I cannot tell you how many of these contracts we're seeing where maybe there is a compensation agreement attached, but it's not checked and listed here under addenda. I think that's very dangerous. You're asking the other parties to be on their best behavior to honor your compensation request. So please, please make sure you're checking a box here for compensation agreement and adding that on that line, okay? So in the case of this example, we're going to have a standard clauses addendum because we're doing an FHA loan. And so we're going to need to use that appraisal protection language that's in the standard clauses addendum. We're going to have a residential property disclosure form that was already filled out by the seller and attached to the MLS. And we're going to have our compensation agreement where we have been authorized as the buyer's agent to ask for our compensation to be paid as a term of this offer. Now, you may see people attaching buyer's agency's agreements. Do not provide your buyer's agency agreement as part of your offer. I see them. You are under no obligation to provide those to the other side of the transaction, to the listing firm, to the listing agent. So do not attach that because it is none of the seller and the listing agent's business what you have on your exclusive right to represent buyer agreement. Now, you're not allowed to ask for more than what you have on your buyer's agreement. But they are not the police. They are not the real estate police who should be vetting that. So the assumption is that you are not going to include anything on a compensation agreement that exceeds what you and your buyer have agreed to pay on the buyer's agency agreement. All right, we're going to go on down here. My buyers intend to occupy the property. It is subject to the Virginia Residential Property Disclosure Act, which is why we attached the residential property disclosure form that was previously filled out by the seller. I'm saying it is not located in a common interest community. Quick sidebar, that used to be called Homeowners Association or Property Owners Association. It is now called Common Interest Community, which includes all three: homeowners, property owners, and condo association. And you're going to indicate below whether it is a POA HOA or a condominium. In this case, in our example, it is not located in a common interest community. So we're going to skip over that. We're going to check the box for it was built after 1978, which is why we have not attached a lead-based paint disclosure form. But if it were built prior to 1978, we would be also attaching the lead-based paint disclosure form that had previously been filled out and signed and initialed by the seller. It is a disclosure form. For both of those forms, residential property disclosure, summary of rights, and lead-based paint disclosure form, the seller must do their part first. If it is not online, ask for it. If it is not online, you've asked for it and they're not going to give it to you, check the box under addenda on page 1 that they are part of this contract and then get it. Do not have your buyer sign either disclosure form first. They cannot agree to a disclosure that has not been made. And it doesn't necessarily mean the contract is unratified, because a judge could say, well, even without these disclosure forms, there was a meeting of the minds that the seller wanted to sell, the buyer wanted to buy under these terms. It's just that the disclosures weren't made. Now, if the residential property disclosure form is not available before execution of the contract, it does give the buyer a termination right. So if you're a listing agent, let's set that bar a little higher. We're going to make sure our seller signed disclosure forms are loaded under the documents tab on our MLS. That way we don't even have to worry about this. And the buyer's agent can go ahead and download them and make them part of the offer package. All right, going on down here, we've got mechanics lien disclosure. The way I explain this is, okay, buyer, when we buy this house, it's conceivable that they have done some work or had some materials delivered for work that has not been paid for. Now, in the state of Virginia, there is something called a mechanics lien where a vendor or a contractor may file a lien at the courthouse on the property 90 days from the last day of the month in which materials were delivered or labor was performed, so long as all of that value is over $50. And then that attaches to the property. And you understand we're making an offer here where we're going to close in 30 days. So that lien could come on the property after you've closed and taken ownership of the property. However, the seller is going to have to sign something at closing that they do not have any outstanding invoices for any work or materials on the property. So it would be a fairly easy case for you to make that they owe you that money. I have, knock on wood, never had it happen. Doesn't mean it couldn't, but I just wanted to disclose that to you that that's a possibility. And then we have our fair housing disclosure and our Megan's Law disclosure. We're not discriminating against any of the parties in this contract due to their protected class status. And here is the phone number or the website for checking the registered sex offender. I already sent you an email with all the online information I could find about this property. So I know you've already done your homework and checked that, but it's here again in the contract just to make sure you know that's available to you. And then we have our fixtures and personal property that will be included. I have included the list of appliances and conveying personal property as it appeared on the MLS. I know we wanted the washer and dryer. They've not included that on the MLS that they're allowing that or having that present. Same with the refrigerator. There is no refrigerator. There is a washer and dryer. Did you want me to add that to this and just see if they'd be willing to convey it at this price? Or do we want to just stick with the appliances that they said are going to convey? And that's a conversation point for you and your buyer. We've put in our purchase price at $314,950 with a $1,500 earnest money deposit. My firm will hold that. We hold it in our non-interest bearing escrow account, and it's credited to you at closing to be used towards your closing costs. So when you show up to closing, you will have already paid $1,500 to closing. Now, a sidebar for y'all is understanding how that $1,500, what happens to that $1,500. It stays in our non-interest bearing escrow account until closing. When we receive your commission check and your settlement disclosure, that gives us permission to transfer those funds from the escrow account to the operating account. And your commission check coming from the settlement company will have been shorted the $1,500. My first closing, I of course said, hey, I'm not so sure my check is right. And they were like, well, don't you have the escrow money at your office? And I was like, I do. So I'm just telling y'all so you don't look like a newbie when you ask that question when you get a commission check. So we then transferred to the operating account. We cut your commission check as it is needing to be cut. And we don't have to run or wire escrow deposits to the settlement companies for every single closing. Okay. Moving on. We're going to do the financing information. I am still seeing contracts come through that do not have the financing information filled out. You are doing a disservice to your buyer when you leave this blank. Because what you've said is the buyer will take any financing under any terms. It doesn't matter. So I always fill out the financing terms in full so that we have that as a buyer to use as an exit strategy if something goes haywire with our financing. So I have said we are doing an FHA loan with I think I did a 3% down payment. So we're doing a 97% loan amount, principal amount, amortized over 30 years at a fixed rate not to exceed 7% with no loan discount points. So I want to explain discount points to you. And I want to explain to you why I put 0 loan discount points. That doesn't mean they can't use discount points. My buyer can buy some discount points. And discount points are where you pay, the buyer pays prepaid interest to buy down their rate. So if they really wanted a 6.75% interest rate, they could buy down their rate with prepaid interest. So they're going to buy the rate down. Those are called discount points, loan discount points. The reason why I don't include them in my financing terms is I'll explain it to you. Now my buyer has to receive a loan at 7% without having to buy it down at 7% over 30 years in that principal amount, in that loan amount, or my buyer has a termination right. So if the interest rate bops up to 7.25% with no loan discount points, my buyer could terminate. They don't have to terminate, but they could. So if that interest rate starts to creep up, I've protected them to say, you're now not obligated to take that mortgage. Now, if it does go up to 7.25% and they decide they want to buy down 0.25% for the rate, they are welcome to. They don't have to terminate, but they could. They could if they wanted to. So that's a way, me as a buyer's agent, I feel it is my obligation to my buyers to build in this protection for them. We're going to go on down now. I do not have a third-party second trust. That is a Wayback Machine type of situation. And then I do not have any other deposit or financing terms because it's a FHA loan, and I'm going to be using the standard clauses addendum to include our appraisal protection language. Now, if this were a conventional loan, I would be putting in a appraisal language right there. And if you click into this on Zip Forms, there'll be a little pencil that shows up above. And I've already put that clause in the clause library for you. And you can go to global clauses and pull down the appraisal clause. And so there will be an appraisal clause for your conventional loan. If you do not write in an appraisal contingency for your conventional loan offer, they will be required to come to closing, even if the appraisal comes in low, and they will be expected to bring the additional funds to close. So please, please, please make sure you are putting in appraisal contingency language every time you use a conventional loan, so long as you and the buyers and the lender have had a conversation about what it would look like if the appraisal came in low. And right here, 11E is what says that the balance of the purchase price will be at settlement from the buyer. That includes a low appraisal amount. So we're going to go on a loan application. I'm going to give my buyers 5 business days to apply for their loan. And if they've not received approval for their loan by May 8th, the seller can terminate. That is really one of the very few termination rights for a seller that's in our contract. And it's important to know as a listing agent that if you just don't have a good feeling about that buyer and the buyer's agent is continuing to delay giving you a pre-approval letter, then the seller is allowed to terminate after this date if the approval letter has not been provided. We're going to go to the next page, and it's going to talk about, in the second paragraph, appraisal required repairs. So if the lender requires repairs, this is very common for VA, FHA, VHDA, occasionally USDA. It is not very common for conventional loans. But if the lender requires repairs as a condition of the loan for the appraisal approval, then the purchaser has the right to ask the seller to make those repairs so that the purchaser may receive their final approval for their loan. But this clause here says that the seller does not have to. The seller can say, no thanks, we're tapped out. We gave you so much money for repairs. We are not going to help you with that appraisal required repair. However, they have to allow the buyer to have it done. Still has to be done by a Virginia licensed contractor unless agreed in writing by all parties. And an example of otherwise agreed in writing by all parties would be there's some peeling, chipping paint on the side of the shed that has to be scraped, collected. You cannot put those scrapings on the ground, and then repainted. If the seller and the buyer decide that they are perfectly fine with that buyer coming over on Saturday and scraping, disposing of the paint chips, and repainting that shed, perfectly fine. Keep in mind the appraiser has to come back out, put their eyeballs back on that repair before they will finalize the appraisal. So what this clause says is it's not the seller's fault you wanted to use FHA loan. So it may become the buyer's responsibility to improve a property they don't own yet. But typically, the repairs that come about as a lender request are not terribly expensive. There are exceptions. There are times when the appraiser is asking for way too many options. This clause protects the seller from not being burdened with those giant repairs, but it also protects the buyer that the buyer could terminate if they do not want to do those repairs themselves at their own expense. And then one of the most important clauses on our contract is this little section here for A through G. I say to buyers, this is a way, all of these are ways in which you can have bad behavior, lose your earnest money, and potentially get sued. So we're not going to do any of these things. These all detail ways in which buyers try to get out of contracts. If you don't want to buy this house, I'm your agent. You come to me and you tell me that you're having second thoughts, you're having cold feet, and we're going to talk our way through and try to find an acceptable termination right that we can exercise to get you out of this contract. Do not quit your job. Do not buy a truck so you can't qualify for the loan. All of those will not get you out of the contract. They just may potentially get you sued. So come to me if you're having second thoughts. And then inspections, I explained to the buyers, there are two routes for inspections. The second route is you get to terminate for any reason during the inspection process, and that's detailed on the next page, but sellers don't like that option because if a new house goes on the market down the street, they are concerned you're going to terminate and go buy that one. So I would recommend we go through the typical regular inspection process where we will have inspections and then we will negotiate repairs. So I have put in here that we will have 10 business days to conduct all of our inspections, and they are at your expense. And I will be sending you an email once we're executed here, detailing all the types of inspections you can have and their estimated cost. And then I'm happy to help you get those lined up on a day that works where you can come attend all those inspections, because I really insist that my buyers are present at least for the home inspection. It is an unprecedented opportunity to speak with the home inspector and take a look at the house on a deep dive level. Now, we have to complete our inspections within 10 business days. But if one of the inspections reveals the need for a follow-up inspection by a specialist, we are allowed in this clause to ask for a 7 business day extension, which I will handle if it turns out that we might need that. So if the home inspector says the HVAC system is not responding, then I can help you secure an HVAC specialist to come over and take a look at it. But since that may fall on their schedule outside of the 10 business days, then I'm going to email the other agent and exercise our right to have a 7 business day extension. It also goes on to talk about that if there is a septic system on the property, this is just notice that we can have any type of septic inspection we wish, whether it's just a dye test where we're making sure the drain field's okay, all the way up to digging up the distribution box, taking a look at it, but we have to put the property back in prior inspection condition. And the seller is also required to provide us reasonable access to be able to accommodate these inspections. Now, if they've poured a concrete pad over the septic system, I do not believe we need to have that conversation quickly, because I don't believe they're going to tear up their concrete slab patio to allow us to have our septic inspection. So that's a conversation that we'll have to have and decide what y'all want to do. It also states here that the seller will make sure all utilities are on, all the systems are in working order so that we can test them. And that there's a delay because they've turned off the gas and they forgot to turn it back on, then we will get an extension equal to the delay. And then after all the inspections are completed, but before our inspection period ends, we are going to write up something called a repair addendum. And on this repair addendum, we are going to detail all of the material defects that were documented through the course of our inspections. If they did not end up on the inspection report, we're not allowed to ask for them. We're also not allowed to ask for anything that is cosmetic. And unfortunately, a lot of material defects start off as cosmetic, and at some point they reach a tipping point, and that tipping point tips them over into material defect. And so there are some items that could be in a gray area. When I'm working for the buyer, I write those in. When I'm working for the seller, I might argue them a little bit. But I'm working for you, so we're going to write in anything that we deem a material defect. Can't be a matter of preference, and especially it can't be anything that is at or beyond its normal useful life, but still functioning properly. And as for the roof, it may be a really old roof, but as long as it's not leaking, it meets the standard for not a material defect. And I wanted to have that conversation with you before we go have the inspections. And I'll remind you about that again after the inspections when we start to put our repair addendum together.
Ashley,
Yeah.
on that roof aspect one, I had a listing a while ago where the roof was repaired by the boots, and the home inspection showed no moisture, and the buyer's agent wanted that roof replaced. And I said, well, I'll pass it on to my sellers. My sellers rejected. I immediately had a termination of contract, release of contract the second I said no.
That was premature.
Wow.
The
Yes.
previous version of our contract used to work that way. This
That's what it was. It
does
was a
not
preview.
work. Yeah, this contract does not work like that. This contract says y'all will keep beating your head against the wall for in this case, 5 business days to try to come to a meeting of the minds. And you will both negotiate in good faith. And if at the end of 5 business days it doesn't work out, then the buyer has a 2-day termination right.
Now, does LAR say the same thing?
I would have to look.
Okay.
Have to look. Yeah.
All right.
And then, as I said, we're going to negotiate for 5 business days, back and forth, as many times as it takes to see if we can come to a mutually agreeable repair addendum. Now, one sidebar I want here is do not fall into old business practices and submit your offers on a removal of contingency form. I've already had a broker in town challenge us to say it was not a valid request because it was not on the repair addendum form. Now, is that being picky? Heck yeah, it is. But I can see where an attorney could get a hold of this and say, well, we didn't think that was the repair addendum because you didn't put it on the proper form. So use the repair addendum when you submit your repair request. Do not use a removal of contingency form. Legally, if both parties sign that removal of contingency form, it's binding. But you may run out of time and they may run out the clock and say, oh, well, you're buying the property now as is because you didn't give us a repair addendum. And then the buyer's agent says, I wrote it on a removal of contingency form. Oh, we didn't realize that was the repair addendum because you didn't use the correct form. So you've now run out of time to ask for repairs. Now, is that going to the attorneys? Yes. Do we want to go to the attorneys? No. So just put it on the repair addendum, okay? At the conclusion of the negotiations, if we do not have a mutually agreeable repair addendum, then the buyer has a 2-day termination right. You cannot terminate before that. Could you ask for a mutual release like I'm about to do on one of my listings, even though I'm real salty about it and don't want to release them? Yes, because I know they're never going to agree because they put a bunch of stuff on there that is cosmetic and a bunch of stuff on there that is grandfathered in when this house was built in 1960. But I have been told by the buyer's agent they are not going to budge on that. Could we go to court and fight this and say you put items on here that are not allowed? Yes. My seller doesn't want to do that. My seller wants to go to the other competing offer that we turned away and see if we can work out something with them. So that's what we're going to do. So we are going to go ahead and mutually release prematurely. I could hold their feet to the fire and make them wait out the whole 5 business days. And then the buyer could terminate and send us a release. But I'm not going to do that. You could. I'm not a particularly petty person. I feel very protective over my sellers, and I'm very annoyed that they will be walking away with nothing because of this buyer's bad behavior. But I want to keep things positive and upbeat for my sellers, and I know what's coming. They're going to wait out the 5 business days, and then they're going to terminate because the buyer's agent told me that's what they're going to do. So we're going to cut them loose on a release and get back to work. So okay, purchaser's option on the next page. I then say, this was the other inspection route that I explained previously. I'm saying it is not applicable because we will not have a termination right just at any point during the inspections. Instead, We are agreeing that we will write up repairs and try to come to a mutually agreed upon repair request and then move forward to closing. And then I say inflow and infiltration inspection is a Western Virginia Water Authority inspection when the property receives sewer service from the Western Virginia Water Authority. If they have public water from Western Virginia Water Authority, but they have a private septic system, an inflow and infiltration inspection is not necessary. That's because the purpose of the inflow and infiltration inspection is for the Western Virginia Water Authority to verify that no gray water, no runoff from gutter downspouts or a sump pump are going into the sewer system, because the Western Virginia Water Authority does not want to clean or go to the expense of cleaning gutter downspout water or sump pump water. That should be rerouted out into the yard to go back into the water table. So this is a seller required inspection. We're gonna, if it is contingent, we're gonna put in here that they are gonna order it not later than 5 business days after ratification of the contract. The seller's gonna order it, get those inspection findings back, try to get a letter of conformity in our file. But in this case, because the city of Salem has their own utility department, it is not contingent upon inflow and infiltration inspection. It is a Western Virginia Water Authority inspection for when they provide sewer services. Also, the letter of conformity is good for 5 years. So if you see that this house was sold to a flipper 2 years ago, you can go to the Western Virginia Water Authority's website. They have a GIS tool on there, and you can look up the property, and there will be a notation there whether there is a letter of conformity on file or not. And if there is, that satisfies, if it's less than 5 years old, that will satisfy this condition. Then I go on to explain, we also are going to have the opportunity to have a pre-settlement verification. This is what in layman's terms we call a walkthrough. We're going to go back to the property just a couple of days prior to closing or the night before closing and just verify that all of the repairs have been completed. The movers didn't put a hole in the wall. Everything looks good. Now, if we discover a defect while we're there that did not exist at the time of inspections, we are allowed to ask the seller to fix it. So if we go in and we find out that now the microwave has died, it's not working, and the microwave is conveying. Don't check my paperwork. I don't remember if I put microwave. So if we put microwave on here and it worked at the time of inspections and now it has died, we are allowed to ask for the seller to repair or replace that microwave. However, the seller is only obligated to spend up to whatever you have in clause 17. So clause 17 says the seller will fulfill their obligations up to $1,000. So in this argument, I do not believe a seller would have an argument to say, I'm not replacing that microwave. I think they would be in breach of contract. Because if the microwave worked at the time of inspections and now no longer works, the seller is obligated up to $1,000 to correct any pre-settlement or pre-occupancy verification findings. Clause 17 also applies to title clouds. So whereas 17 a long time ago used to be the threshold at which the seller's maximum repair dollars sat, it is not that anymore. Now this is the maximum dollars the seller has to pay to clear up any title issues and or any new defects found during the pre-settlement verification walkthrough. Now, let's go back up a little bit. 16A is the clause we use when we are having the inspection process as detailed in 14A and B. And 16B is if we are not having inspections. So if it's not contingent upon inspections, and instead we had 14, let's see here, we just said we're not having any inspections. We still are allowed to have a walkthrough and make sure there is nothing that has changed on the property since we toured it and purchased it. So if a tree is now on the property or a giant hole is in the floor, that was not how it was when you went under contract. You are allowed to ask for that to be repaired. However, it is still capped out at that amount you have in clause 17 as a seller obligation. 16 goes on to say that the seller will allow for inspectors and access and all that. They'll keep the utilities on. They will make sure that the property is in broom clean condition and exercise reasonable and ordinary care in the maintenance and upkeep of the property. That includes paying your taxes, not getting foreclosed on, paying your mortgage payment. Okay. So the seller must continue to do all of those things. And if the seller delays in complying with any of these, it may end up pushing closing, and everybody needs to acknowledge that. And then E states that every repair on this property is going to have to be done by someone licensed in their field, cannot be a handyman. And I just had a transaction like this where I represented the buyer and they had the son go ahead and do the repairs, even though we said no, because they wanted to ask forgiveness instead of permission. So we said, okay, well, I guess we can't go back in time. Could you please have a contractor go over and verify that all these repairs were done correctly and have them sign off on that? I get an invoice, $150 from so-and-so handyman services that they verified that all of the son's repairs were done correctly. Cool. Could you please provide me the contractor license number for such and such handyman services? Oops, good call, Ashley. Turns out they're just a handyman. They're not a licensed contractor. Okay, so could you please get a contractor to come verify the handyman's invoice, verifying the son's work? So then they had to pay another $150 to a contractor to come over and verify the work that had been performed. Now, unfortunately, I saw on the settlement statement that the listing agent paid the actual contractor. The listing agent should not have had to have paid that. And maybe this is a case where the sellers just weren't listening, but I appreciate the listing agent doing what had to be done to get this thing to closing and to honor the spirit of this contract. However, you have to communicate to your sellers. No, your son may not do the work. Yes, I understand it's silly. It's silly that we have it in here that a contractor must do this work. Let me help you. I've got plenty of contractors on hand who will do it for a reasonable rate. Your son is not allowed to do it. Please do not allow your son to do it. Otherwise, it's going to cause us more money on the back end. So please let me help you facilitate these repairs. And then if they say, okay, well, we've got somebody who can come over and verify these. Are they a licensed contractor? May I have their contractor's license number? Because I know the buyer's agent is going to ask me for it. It is your job to run this transaction and to communicate with your sellers properly and buyers. Okay, 17, we talked about that. If you leave it blank, it's going to default to $1,000. Then we have 18, buyer. Do not default on this contract. We discussed the ways in which you could default on this contract. Please do not. Everybody can come sue you. I do not want that happening. If you have a problem and you have an issue, come to me and let's work together. We can call in my broker and see what we can do to brainstorm a solution. Next page states that buyer, you can choose any settlement company you wish. Do you happen to have a settlement company you would like to use? Otherwise, I am happy to recommend one that I work with frequently and that I think would do a wonderful job for you. Title insurance disclosure. You are going to have to buy lender's title insurance because the mortgage company is going to require that as a condition of your loan. The settlement company can set up that policy for you. I would highly recommend you also purchase an owner's policy. It is a one-time premium. It covers you for the life of your ownership of this property if any title issues crop up later or somebody comes to make a claim against you on the property. Now, in a court of law, they may give the house to the previous owner who did not get foreclosed on properly, or the divorce proceedings did not happen properly. Something could have happened in that title chain that would empower a judge to give the house back to them. You would still be responsible for your mortgage, but that's where an owner's title insurance policy comes into play and helps protect you. So I would highly recommend it. It's going to be a one-time premium. Probably it's already been included in your good faith estimate from your lender. And we've got our settlement company here and our closing date. This is an on or about date. This can seem very unfair when the other party isn't coming to closing on time, but I'll tell you, It is absolutely wonderful when our lending gets a little delayed or there's a hiccup on title. We don't have a voidable contract when this date comes and goes. Instead, in good faith, we all say we understand that that is a target date for closing, and we're all working hard to meet that target date. But if something delays closing, it is not a voidable contract. We're all going to work together to just close it as soon as we can. Wire fraud, again, a reminder that we want to be very careful about wire fraud. So please communicate with whoever at the settlement company is designated as your point person, and make sure you're verifying those wire instructions with them. And assignability, we're not going to assign this contract to an LLC or a trust. Y'all are going to take title to this property as you appear on page 1 of the purchase agreement. And then I do not have any additional terms. We're turning down the offer of a home warranty program. If you'd like to have that discussion about a home warranty program, I'm happy to have that with you and provide you some resources. But I do not want to make it a term of our offer. This is our standard provisions page. It talks about how you will be required to pay for any remaining fuel or propane in the tank. This property does not have an oil tank or a propane tank. If it did, I would have included the oil or propane remaining in the tank under the personal property so that the seller must convey that to you at no expense at closing. Otherwise, this clause says that you are responsible for reimbursing the seller for any remaining fuel. Land use assessment does not apply to this residential property. Risk of loss says that if there is a gigantic loss, like a tree falls on the house, you do have a termination right if you choose to, but you do not have to terminate. But this allows you to, if you'd like to scratch, move on, find another house. Title, the seller must convey clear title to us. If they do not, they are burdened in clause 17 to spend up to $1,000 to try to clear the title. An important thing to note is that if a title cloud is discovered, we, the buyers, must give the sellers 30 calendar days to clear up the title cloud before we have a termination right. So it may delay our closing, but we have to give them 30 days to work it out and try to clear the title cloud or the title issue. If they cannot after 30 calendar days, then we have a termination right and we can go on and find another property. If they have any certificates, they're going to convey those to us, warranties, anything like that. And then this is the definition of some of the lending terms. But in this case, we're not asking for closing costs to be paid on our behalf. So I do not need to go over those with you. This is our signature page. We're going to sign this to submit our offer. And then because you're doing an FHA loan, we are going to include what's called a standard clauses addendum, where we are going to indicate that we are using a government loan. It is a HUD or VA amendatory clause requirement to include the purchase price here, to state that if the appraisal comes in below $314,950, you, the buyer, can terminate. You are not required to bring the extra cash or the appraisal shortfall to closing. Now, I'm going to attempt to renegotiate and say, hey, seller, listing agent, our appraisal came in $5,000 low. Would y'all have a conversation with us about lowering the purchase price or coming up with some sort of creative way to accommodate this appraisal shortfall? I'm also happy to look at the appraisal if you will share it with me. I do not get a copy of it because it belongs to you, the buyer. But if you want to share it with me, I'll look for any maybe mistakes or an oversight possibly. I'm happy to look at it. And then we also have to check the box here that it is an FHA insured mortgage transaction and that we are going to comply with any of their requests. We're not going to use any of the other clauses on this addendum except the leased equipment disclosure. And we're going to state that there is no leased equipment conveying with the property. And then lastly, we have our compensation agreement. When we did our buyer's agency agreement a few weeks ago, I indicated to you that I was going to use our offer as a path to ask for my firm's fee to be paid on your behalf as part of the offer. This is the form that allows me to do that. I'll draw your attention that the fee that we're asking for the seller to pay matches what is on our exclusive right to represent buyer form. So if they accept our offer, they are going to pay that fee, the seller will, as a term of our offer. And you will then be relieved of that obligation from our buyer's agency agreement because instead it'll be built into our contract. and my firm will get paid at closing. And that is all of the forms I have for you today, and we can go ahead and execute them and get our offer in. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If I can make my screen big enough to do that. And I'm going to let you guys unmute yourself and ask questions. I need to
stop recording.
Bigger so I can get to my share screen feature.